All right, first I got to mess up all of Scott's notes and put things out of order. I first met Scott Shaw in the fall of 2003 when I moderated a paper session at the East Central Regional Conference of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. In that session, Scott presented a paper with the provocative title, Dissecting the Plastic Crawfish. At the time, Scott was an assistant professor at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and I was immediately impressed with his combination of scholarly earnestness and intellectual mischief. As we continued to cross paths at various academic conferences, Scott became a central figure amongst a group of young, energetic faculty from schools in Louisiana whom I came to think of as the Gumbo Mafia. In the spring of 2006, Scott graciously agreed to come to Lawrence Tech to critique the work of my sophomore students who had undertaken projects in post-Katrina New Orleans, and I was fortunate to be able to return the favor in the fall of 2009. I consider Scott to be a friend, kindred spirit, and co-conspirator who was a significant sounding board as I took the first steps towards launching our massive change-themed graduate design studio. Today, Scott is an assistant professor of architecture at Temple University, where he teaches classes in innovative material technologies, sustainability, urban research, and design build. In 2006, he founded the International Design Clinic, a registered nonprofit which gives students the chance to use their unique creative talents to aid communities in need around the world. Since that time, students and volunteers from around the world have worked with the IDC to design and construct projects on 5 continents. Since its inception, the work of the IDC has been presented at numerous national and international venues, including invited lectures at Philadelphia University, Pratt University, Parsons New School, and the University of Maryland. Recently, Interior Design Magazine paired the work of Professor Shaw with that offered by Kengo Kuma Associates, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, Buckminster Fuller, and the Arcosanti Urban Laboratory in an article highlighting practitioners who are challenging the edge of design practice. He holds a bachelor's degree from the Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Cincinnati and a master's degree from Tulane University. He is a registered architect whose practice has undertaken projects of various scales and typologies, all informed by the desire to address social, economic, and cultural forces, as well as those offered by the natural environment. Scott's work has been recognized with grants from the City of New Orleans, the Ludwig Family Foundation, and the American Institute of Architects. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scott Shaw, who will be presenting a lecture entitled, Giving a Damn is Not Enough, Reconstructing Humanitarian Architecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Shaw.
The microphone up here. I wander, sometimes aimlessly, sometimes with aim. Thank you very much for that. If I can get a copy of that, that would be wonderful. I have never thought of myself in that vein, but it's a very gracious introduction. I thank you. In Linda Pullman's new book, The Crisis Caravan, she documents an alarming link between the escalation of atrocities committed within war-torn countries and the corresponding rise in Western media attention, as well as the resulting boom in aid received by the residents of said country. This has incentivized certain warring parties to escalate the atrocities created in order to garner new media attention and thus garner new Western support. Groups that at one time were holding people prisoner would move quickly to dismembering said people in an earnest attempt to gain more Western cameras and thus get more aid, which they could either hijack and use for armaments or other things. It's a happy day, isn't it? I won't go into really into-depth stories and because they get pretty sobering. But I'll let you, there's the book there, and I'll let you go see it. But she says that sowing horror to reap aid is, quote, the logic of the humanitarian era. She's not alone. Others have noticed this disturbing link. The reason that many of them say, such as Marin here, Michael, is that charity and development work are inherently political acts, ripe for redirection and reorientation. Now, those practicing humanitarian architecture are well acquainted with this link. In a recent interview with Metropolis magazine, Cameron St. Clair, founding director of Architecture for Humanity, describes how an AFH program intended to form a baking cooperative operated by the widows of tsunami victims in Sri Lanka was canceled when the women began to receive death threats from a local mobster involved with a baking monopoly in that place. Here, humanitarian efforts became counterproductive. Elsewhere, they become ineffective. Most of the people in this room probably know this work, the play pump, designed by Trevor Field and Ronnie Stevers, although you probably know it better in this format. Of course, for those of you who still don't get it, there it is, right? Now, the play pump is obviously, it's an instrument that's meant to allow people to harvest water from subsurface as children play. So as they spin on this wheel, it pumps water up. It's a rather clever instrument. It was designed in 1996, as you can see, and so right now, what I found interesting is a lot of people know it in this state, 1 year out of the box, or less than 1 year, a few minutes out of the box. Few people know what's happening with it now, at least until Frontline did a bit of a documentary on it.
You're watching The Rundown. I'm Hari Srinivasan. Frontline World has a new documentary out called Troubled Water. We are joined by the producer-director, also the journalist on the film, Amy Costello. Thanks for being with us.
It's nice to be here, Hari.
All right, so Troubled Water takes a look at a kind of development tool or technology that was supposed to help the problems that people had with hand pumps in small villages and developing nations. Basically kind of a merry-go-round, if you will, that kids would play on and that would pump water, right? You found this story, or you did this story several years ago.
That's correct. Yes, I did.
And so why go back and revisit it?
Well, about a year ago, I found out, after I'd reported on this technology a couple of times for Frontline World, I found out that there were some problems in the field with the technology. About a year after my story had been broadcast, about an announcement from Washington came that they were going to donate about $16 million between the U.S. government and the Case Foundation to expand this technology across several African nations. And after that announcement in 2006, I assumed that the technology was rolling out well and that lots of people across Africa were getting fresh, clean drinking water due to this technology called the play pump. But I found out about a year ago that things were not going well. So I went with a camera and went back to Africa to find out for myself on the ground what was going on.
So what are some of the kind of systemic challenges? Is it an organizational problem? Is it a rollout problem? Is it a problem with the actual tool itself?
I think part of it was this push to get many play pumps into the ground on a fairly quick timeline. And I think that proved to be challenging from a maintenance point of view, that pumps would break down and they were not able to be fixed. And that had significant repercussions because, you know, as I say, we're not talking about television sets that are breaking down. We're talking about people's access to clean drinking water. So when a pump breaks down, that's really critical. And can be detrimental to a community. And I think there were also kind of cultural issues that arose. I think that not every community where a play pump was installed necessarily in the end wanted this technology. So there was some pushback from the users themselves. And I think finally the main thing is that this is supposed to be a toy that children play on. And as they pump and spin around and round on the play pump, fresh water is pumped at the same time. And I think they found that children, like everywhere in the world, sometimes get tired of playing on one toy all the time. But if they were relying on the energy of children, they really needed them to be spinning and spinning literally for hours a day to provide adequate water. And of course they weren't. And that's another thing that I found on the ground there in my reporting.
Your film also starts to highlight perhaps the reluctance to admit failure on the parts of large foundations. I mean, I think everybody wants a big win, everybody's well-intentioned, but they don't necessarily want to be forthright when they say, okay, maybe this didn't really work.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, you know, as I learned in the course of my reporting, I think that this is a problem that arises in many parts of the nonprofit world. It wasn't just those involved with the play pump rollout. I think this kind of happens across development in many parts of the world. There's lots of enthusiasm initially for programs, and sometimes things don't work out as everybody had hoped. And you're absolutely right. I think it was a program that started with very good intentions. And everybody there, including myself, really thought this was a wonderful thing, that so many millions of dollars were going into rolling out this program. And I think in the end, when feedback started coming from the field that things weren't going well, as far as I can tell from the reporting that I did and the many people that I spoke to, I think there was a reluctance to publicly admit to the donors, to the public who were so enthusiastic about this technology, that yes, we're encountering problems. You know, maybe we need to scale back, maybe we need to stop fundraising, maybe we need to reassess. And I think those conversations were held often behind closed doors, but certainly not out in the public. And I think that's a really important lesson from this story, that I think when you're willing to kind of acknowledge shortcomings, the public will be very supportive. But I think there was a lack of communication in that regard.
And perhaps somebody won't have to repeat the same mistakes next time.
That's what I hope. That's what I hope.
All right, Amy Costello, producer, director, and journalist for Frontline World. Thanks so much for your time today.
All right, it's my pleasure.
You can watch her.
finish elsewhere. What did I just do? I just
You're watching
right now. All right. Although it might be consoling for humanitarian designers or people who try to root their design practice to try to distance oneself from such failings by blaming the individual. The designers did not root the project in the community. They didn't use cutting-edge participatory practices. They didn't get the right people to the table during design and construction. They imposed their will. It would actually be entirely inaccurate to do so. The AFH program, like many other good-intentioned initiatives of the architects, such as rural studios, that sometimes lead to unfortunate ends, ran their work with a keen eye to the best practices. Indeed, are lauded as being cutting edge in this regard by many of the magazines that we read as both professionals and students. Nevertheless, even if they were working closely and diligently with local widows and other partners to develop plan and seek out funding, the fact remains that these projects don't always result in the way that we intend. Such as this project 7 years after its construction, when it became so deteriorated they had to rip the windshields that we all know and love, right? The cornerstone of the design response. They ripped them off, and the trailer that this was meant to substitute was moved back on site. The lesson learned, of course, is that the architects were able to provide something that lasted 7 years, and then the old trailer, which they had used previous to the architects ever coming to the site, was the thing they turned to use again. The problem here is not the work, nor is it the process that brought it into being. It is with the set of beliefs that guided both. To succeed here, I believe the architect needs to abandon much of what they have learned about humanitarian design. It's not about getting the right parties to the table, it's about deconstructing the table and inventing new mechanisms to cultivate methods of exchange through the design and construction process. It is not about finding the right people to pay for the work. It is about designing the work in a manner that slowly generates new and unanticipated users, funders, programs, and owners. It is not about finding the right geographic site to house a well-intentioned and well-programmed facility. It is about finding the right condition and then allowing new geographic locations to surface. To embrace these and other essential shifts requires the humanitarian architect to engage one final and pressing truth. That is not about constructing grand gestures that attempt to solve anything. It is about constructing small works that, through their careful location on persistent conditions, earn not only the right to exist, but to be possessed by others who will evolve and advance the work over time. The time has come for truly collaborative architecture, an architecture brought about by the wisdom of crowds. Now, unfortunately, crowds have a pretty bad rap. In the popular imagination, masses, crowds, tend to be stupid. Henry David Thoreau lamented, "The mass never comes up to the standard of its best member, but on the contrary degrades itself to a level with the lowest." Nietzsche, "Madness is the exception, individuals rule in the groups." English historian Thomas Carlyle, "I do not believe in the collective wisdom or individual ignorance." Yet experience would indicate that crowds can be quite smart. Now, this is not a scientific study, but it is interesting to know that when the people on this game show were allowed to call their expert friends, the experts provided the right answer 65% of the time. When they asked random people assembled in the audience, they received the right answer 91% of the time. Now, what's fascinating, now again, I think you need to put an asterisk by it. It's not a scientific study, and having watched a little bit of the show, I believe that some of that's due to the fact that the participants in this game show thought the crowd to be stupid and thus threw them the softball questions. And they held out and only asked the experts when there was a question that warranted it. But fortunately, there are other studies. And actually, we had help here. Andy, where are you? Andy, we had help. Jelly bean exercise. This is the cue. What do I do? This? Do this? Where's Andy? We had a student tabulating the results of this. Did he fall asleep? Is he eating the M&Ms? Could someone get Andy in the room? He's still counting. All right, well, we'll let Andy come whenever Andy wants to come. In the meantime, I'm going to press on. That's a shame, too. I had a nice little image of a jelly bean jar. Isn't that a shame? Darn it. Andy here yet? No, all right. I'll have another example. I'll actually go back to a Maloney and Malloran study that after the explosion, this is the Challenger explosion, after this disaster, the stocks of 4 major contractors were dumped immediately. Lockheed, which managed the ground support for this, Martin Marietta, which manufactured the ship's external fuel tank, Morton Thickall, which built the solid fuel booster rocket, and Rockwell International, which built the shuttle and the main engines. It's not fascinating that all 4 manufacturers responsible for building this thing were dumped. People could see what was coming down the pipeline, and it wasn't pretty for those corporations. What was fascinating is at the end of the trading of that day, Thickall's stock dropped 12%. The others, 3%. There's no public comment, there was no study, and it wasn't until 6 months later that the Presidential Commission on the Challenger revealed that the O-ring seals on the booster rockets made by Thickall were at fault. Let's go to the Mirage in Vegas. Now, those of you that don't, not literally, I'm sorry. Let's all go to my plane. Oh, I'm sorry. The way it works in Vegas when you're betting on sports is for the casino to make money, they need a 50-50 split. The reason is if you're the bookie taking in the money and you want to put down a $20, say you want to put down a $20 or $10 bet, you're going to pay $11. $10 on the bet and $1 for the booking itself. That $1 is called the vigorish or the vig. And that's what the bookie makes as long as he gets a 50-50 split. If people go the wrong way and the results fall in that direction, he loses his vig or she loses her vig. What's fascinating is the opening line is set by the bookmaker trying to get the 50-50 split and then adjusted by the bettors as they come in real time, each bettor independently operating in accordance with their logic and putting down their money. What's fascinating is roughly 75% of the time, the Mirage's final line will be the most reliable forecast of NFL football games on the face of the planet, as adjusted by the accumulated wisdom of people piling their money one after another. That's the best gauge you could have. The works in other sports reflect this as well. A 3-to-1 horse will win 25% of the time. Now, the exception to this is sports without much betting, so you cricket fans, I'm sorry, because the size of the group does matter. The other exception is actually in the aforementioned horse racing, because in horse racing, more than any other sport, people love a long shot, and they bet on it in a disproportionate amount. They don't bet on it logically. So what's the disconnect? If experience would dictate that under the right circumstances, groups can be remarkably intelligent and often smarter than the smartest people in them, then why are we looking upon them so skeptically? I think the key is found in the beginning of this, under the right circumstances. I think the mechanisms used by our field as well as others do not encourage the wisdom of crowds, but rather their madness. I'm going to highlight 4 myths that you've probably come in contact with, either as you've practiced humanitarian design, studied it in the school, talked about sustainability, etc., that I think we need to put to rest right now if we want to succeed within this venue. Myth number 1, a misplaced faith in meetings. When you are involved in participatory design practices, one of the popular ways to do this, you go assemble a crowd of people and bring them into a classroom, bring them into a room, bring them to the table, right? And you try to get as diverse as possible. You put the ads out of the papers, everyone you can think of, you go ask. The problem is that the mechanism itself is inherently biased. Where are you putting the classroom? Who is closer to that classroom than others? Who can access that classroom through public transit?
Can't hear you.
Not at all. How about now? No, I'm on mute. I'm not going to repeat that. Oh my gosh, there we go. All right. I should have actually adjusted this first. How much of that did you miss? The whole thing. All right. What I was saying is basically the minute you set up a classroom environment in which to place this participatory design process, you've biased it in a way that is actually you cannot remove yourself from. The time that you select will inherently will prejudice the meeting towards certain people and away from other people. If you put it towards the night, automatically people who work at night or cannot get childcare will not come. If you put it during the day, the working class will not be there. If you put it in this section of town, those people that have public access to this section of town can do it. Those people who do not will not. Those people who have cars can do it. Those people who walk can do it. Those people who cannot will not. You can either set up to have an infinite number of meetings in order to account for the multitude of subcultures that are invested in any participatory design practice, or you can begin to question the classroom as a whole. I think it's smarter to the latter. I would wonder why we came about this kind of faith in the meeting and how that came to be. I think this is the other part I want to bring attention to is just the publication of the meeting and getting people there. You will get the same people to the meeting because you'll have the same group of people basically interested in the work and having the time to respond to it. Again, an advertisement can be designed to catch a wide swath of people, but it will naturally prejudice itself towards certain people groups and away from other people groups. So again, you're kind of confronted with, do I put a multitude of ads out there for a multitude of times and a multitude of locations so as to get a truly participatory process? Or do I question the classroom? Again, I think we need to question the classroom. All of these things lead to a homogeneity of the group and also lead to what's called groupthink, where deliberation in a groupthink setting has a disturbing effect of not opening people's minds, but of closing them over time, emphasizing consensus over dissent, and preferring the illusion of certainty to the reality of doubt. There was an experiment by Gerald and he selected 8 people, and he brought them into a room, and he asked them to assess the performance of 32 psychology students. And he gave all 8 people 2 bits of information, attendance and GPA. He then pulled two of those people aside, and he gave them a little bit of extra information, 1 other factor. He pulled 2 other people aside and gave them 2 extra factors that no one else got. He then observed the conversation, the deliberation that occurred within that classroom. The entirety of the conversation was rooted on the 2 bits of shared information. The other 6 bits of information that were offered were completely ignored within the content of that conversation. And the student's assessment was 100% based on the 2 pieces of shared information. What he observed is groupthink. What he observed is the fact that when everyone was given 2 pieces of information in an unstructured, free-flow conversation, that information tends to be discussed in a disproportionate amount, the information which is shared. It's unfortunate, especially when you're dealing with community-centered work, because it's often the dissenters that have the most value. Myth 2, faith in consensus. The search for consensus encourages tepid, lowest common denominator solutions which offend no one rather than exciting anyone. Instead of fostering a free exchange of conflicting views, consensus-driven groups trade in familiar and squelch provocative debate. An experiment by Solomon Asch. 7 to 9 people were placed in a row. You've seen this experiment. I hope that you have. It's fascinating. There was one subject to the experiment, the person at the end of the line. However, that person thought there were 7 to 9 participants in the experiment. He thought, or she thought, the experiment was basically to guess which of those lines was the same size as that line. What he or she did not know is the first 8 respondents were all told to pick the wrong line. So all 8 respondents chose line B, chose line C. What he found is roughly 2/3 of the time, the respondent would agree at least once with the group rather than their own eyeballs. And 33% of the time, the respondent would do it more than once, that they would doubt their own eyeballs over the group. Social comparison is a powerful thing, and it's a part of the way we make judgments. And the best collective decisions are the product of disagreement and contest, not consensus or compromise. The best way to operate, I believe, and I'll bear this out with some work I'm about to show, it figures out how to create mechanisms that allow people to accumulate their wisdom independently, to aggregate and produce collective judgments that represent not what any one person thinks, but in a sense what they all think. Paradoxically, the best way for a group to be smart is for each person in it to think and act as independently as possible. Myth 3, faith and deliberation. An information cascade occurs in most deliberations, wherein the first bit of information to be shared with the group has an unequal wield over the rest of the conversation. It directs the conversation. So all of a sudden, the person who's the loudest, the person who is the more forthright, not the person who's right, is the one dictating the course of the conversation, the entirety of the conversation, because of the linear kind of way in which information cascade works. They frame the conversation. That compounded with a phenomenon called social comparison, where you compare the position of yourself to the group, and over time, you gradually come to believe what the group believes. That kind of social comparison works. These things, all of a sudden, allows the entire group to start to go to whatever the first person said as they framed the conversation. This is how deliberation works, which should scare the hell out of you if you're ever in front of a jury of your peers, right? You better hope that the loudest person thinks you're innocent. The social proof is the tendency to believe that if a lot of people believe a certain thing, they must have a good reason for doing so. Another reason, or another way of phrasing this, is herding. An experiment by Milgram, Bickman, and Berkowitz, 1968. A single individual was placed on a street corner looking skyward. A few people at nothing. Nevertheless, a few people stopped and did likewise, peering into the nothingness in search of nothing. They then amped up the ante and placed 5 people on that corner. This time, 4 times as many people looked skyward. They then placed 15 people on the corner, looking at nothing. 45% of the passers-by looked upward. And they continued to add until eventually they got 80% of the passers-by to look upward as well. After all, if everyone else is looking up, they must have a good reason for so doing. It is that tendency which allows deliberation, combined with the information cascade earlier cited, to be a suspect, let's say, mode of design generation. Myth number 4, and this one might sting. Faith in the architect. There's no real evidence that one can become an expert in something as broad as decision-making or policy or strategy. Auto repair, skiing, perhaps management, sure. These are skills that yield application, hard work, and even maybe native talent. But forecasting an uncertain future and deciding the best course of action in the face of that future are much less likely to lend themselves to that kind of expertise. Now, exceptions do exist. For example, Warren Buffett is pretty good at investing and has a pretty decent track record. However, as past success is no guarantee of future results, the long-term potential of the expert remains a little suspect. Mutual fund experts between 1984 and 1999 were compared to the Wilshire 5000 index. And they found that almost 90% of the mutual fund experts underperformed the Wilshire index. Even more interesting is that if you were to ask an expert a set of questions, the between expert agreement in a host of fields, including stock picking, livestock judging, and clinical psychology, is below 50%, meaning the experts are just as likely to disagree as they are to agree. What exacerbates this far more is the fact that experts also tend to be very overconfident, believing that they know far more than they actually do. Scott Page, an interesting study on intelligence. He created a computer-simulated program where he had solving agents of varying intelligence placed into teams and then gave these virtual teams problems to solve. And some of the teams he composed entirely of very, very smart agents, and others he had an assortment. And what he found is the ones that had varied intelligence actually outperformed the super smart teams. The reason is because intelligence is but one tool. And that by biasing a team towards that one tool, he actually cut the legs out from the creative process of that team, and they could not problem solve as capably. The development of knowledge may depend, I'm going to quote James March, the development of knowledge may depend on maintaining an influx of the naive and ignorant, and competitive victory does not reliably go to the properly educated. In light of this, I'd like to offer 4 alternatives. And I'll illustrate them as I've kind of come into contact with them within my own work. And they're inspired by Sarawecki, Wisdom of Crowds, a great book. A number of the studies that I've pointed to today actually are featured within that volume. And as he's saying, it's not so much, it's about using these tendencies, satisfying these conditions, diversity, independence, and decentralization that allows a group to be intelligent, becomes the kind of the way that we should work. And so creating a useful group dynamic, where do you start in terms of design? I think the first thing is to realize that you want to aggregate wisdom. This can be a great time to talk about jelly beans. You forgive me for not having a slide. Andy, do we have the results?
This is where they exceed the average.
Okay. What was the average?
480.
Okay. So in the jelly bean jar, all right, the first thing, the highest bid was a bid of 4,761 M&Ms. Congratulations, Justin. The lowest would be Cameron B, a guess of 98. That's quite a range. The average was 480. The truth was 475. What's fascinating about this is if you take it out and you take out how many people are actually closer than the average, you'll actually get a very small amount. Who is the winner? Do you have the winner? Did you pick the winner? All right, you're going to pick the winner right now. We got to give those beans away. I'm not taking them. All right. What you will find in that exercise is that if the people operate independently in accordance with their own wisdom and they're motivated to get the right answer, and you allow them not to bias each other through groupthink or deliberation or anything like that, you just tell them to shut up, write down your number, and put it in the vat, that the group will perform at the 97th percentile every time. Every time. Most assuredly, there'll be a few people who get closer than the group. The interesting thing, those people change every time you do the exercise. The group never does. The group will always be at the 97th percentile of guessing the jelly beans. I think we, again, need to call into question, how does this start to apply itself in what we believe to be participatory or collaborative design processes? Aggregating wisdom, creating useful group dynamics that allow the diversity of a group to show itself as they operate independently, with a series of checks and balances where someone bidding 98 counters someone bidding 4,700, right? That you can be biased and irrational, but as long as you're independent, you will not make the group any dumber. This is key when working on community-based work here and abroad and everywhere else. You are not going to be able, these are the only two people.
There was a tie.
Okay. And what was the average again?
480.
480, which was how many away?
5.
Okay. So no one beat, actually the group was what, at the 99th percentile this time? No one beat the average of the group. This time you were all dumber than the average. Was that it?
475.
457. 457.
457. Then you got one.
Oh.
You said 475. This is.
I'm sorry, one person beat the group. Way to go. Who is Matthew C? You're smarter than the group, Matthew C. Congratulations. You can pick up your M&Ms on the way out. Let's give Matthew C a round of applause for being smarter than the group. Really well done. Okay. Where was I? I'm thinking M&Ms now. Simultaneous decision-making minimizes cascade thinking, which occurs when decisions are made sequentially. Instead, you make decisions simultaneously. Trying to make specific, now to do this well, you have to allow everyone to have enough knowledge to operate efficiently. Linux actually did a pretty good job of this by releasing their code in an open source way and then inviting anyone who could understand that code and had a few moments to correct the bugs in the system. If they did not supply that code and they just went out there and asked people to solve their system for them, it wouldn't have worked. They needed to supply that core information, as we do as designers. I supplied you with the visual evidence of a jar full of M&Ms. That was the comparable data set by which you can all operate and push against. For me, when we worked in the IDC, and this was the first project many, many moons ago, when we were asked by a local nonprofit in Lafayette, Louisiana, to design a playhouse that would be auctioned off and the money given to a local group that helps grieving children provide services for them free of charge. And we asked right away, what happens? They gave us $3,500, to build this. Our first question was, what happens to the money if we don't use it all? And they said, well, we get it. So we gave it back to them and said, we'll build it for nothing. Not really thinking what that meant. But then we ran around and eventually landed on a design response that was all those ends of the boards that Lowe's cuts off so people with small cars like myself can fit it in there, and local cabinet makers, and designed a way of working that stacked these things up in a kind of a Tetris-like formation. You drilled a hole every 6 inches, no matter what the size of the wood, used threaded rods and bolts and washers, and you stitched the whole thing together. What was interesting about that is that language became a kind of a way that you allowed everyone to enter into the riff. And we completed this work in 5 days. Because there wasn't a plan. In fact, there were some students from Virginia Tech that came and said, where's the plan? I don't know where the plan is, right? Where's the section? Where's the other? I don't know. Here, but this is how you do it. Drill a hole, put this in, right? And make it cool. But they got it. And everyone got it. Musicians got it. The girlfriends of architecture students got it. The boyfriends of interior design and industrial design students got it. They all got it. And we had a great time working through the night on this thing, to get it built. There it is. I'm not lying to you. It's through the night, right? It was a language that allowed the people to aggregate their wisdom in a small way. Now, I want to admit to this, that this is not I'm not heralding this. This is before I knew what the hell I was doing. The diversity of this team was inherently limited. The insiders were the students that I was working with. They were architects, interior designers, industrial designers. Incredibly biased group you are, right? And so the diversity of the team were very limited. But it worked in this situation. It didn't work when we went to Romania. That we maintained the independence of the team. And one of the things I did do when we worked is I allowed the simultaneous deployment of wisdom, so that we would all stick ideas on the wall and tried our best not to allow information cascade to occur in the ensuing conversation. So tried to find ways that everyone could voice their wisdom at the same time and to accumulate that. And that's how that project was formed. We used that again in Romania, but one of the things that came obvious to us is the foreign context placed a lot of pressure on the realm of the expert within our team, right? Even though we were accumulating wisdom within the team, our team was, again, industrial designers, interior designers, and architects. And to be quite honest, from the US. We did not have nearly enough insight to do a reasonable work in this context. So what did we do? We threw away what we knew, or thought we knew, and we expanded our team. Specifically what we threw away, things like we had actually experimented before going. We were pretty pumped up with that last work. And we were, all right, let's find all the scraps we can possibly find and just experiment with them. Let's mess with them. And we had all these clever things that we were doing. Very, very clever. Almost as clever as that play pump, right? And we had these and we were ready to go with these very clever things that we as designers very, very much liked. And we got there and found that Romanians don't have scrap at all. The Roma people, who have very little, make entire, you can see a Roma population up at the top there, they make complete villages out of scrap. And so we either went to war with the Roma, which we'd lose, over broken bits of brick, or we found a new way, and we found a new way. And we found it by starting to ask around, by starting to get other people to independently offer their wisdom. And finally, we talked to some construction guy. I wish I knew his name. I don't know his name. He said, oh, well, you get a truck over here, you can have that dirt. He said it in Romanian, but you get the point, right? So he said, all right, how much is a truck? $50. Well, we could have it all day. That's great. So we ran around with our truck all day long, gathering all the dirt, broken bits of concrete, and everything else we could possibly find. We drag it to the site where the people we were working with, and this time it was a group that abandoned children is a big problem in Romania for reasons we won't go into, but it's been going on for like 2 decades. So now kids who are abandoned are now making ends meet either through crime or prostitution. Those who choose the latter oftentimes become pregnant in line of their work. They're thus faced with the same decision. Do I starve or do I abandon my child as I myself was abandoned, right? This group says a third option is you can come live here, we'll teach you a trade, and you can keep your child and kind of changes a cycle. One thing about the IDC is we don't help people who don't address cycles. If you're so naive to think you're addressing a static condition, we're not going to help you. If you recognize the fact that you're in the midst of a cycle that has political means, is entrenched in kind of dynamics of power within your situation, then we can talk, because then our work will actually make sense. So within this, all of those people became to the drawing board, and the client, who I guess would be the group running the house, said, why are you bringing dirt to our house and broken bits of concrete? And there were piles of it. And we said, we don't know. We think we're going to build your playground with this that you wanted us to build. They wanted a play area in the back for the kids and the mothers to kind of build a relationship. We think we're going to do that, but we're not sure how. You really? You don't know how? But you're going to get rid of this. We think so. All right. So what eventually happened is we then started to play with this material independently. And eventually someone landed, I don't remember who, the idea that we could actually make a pretty elaborate little play landscape of topography, which was pretty perfect for the little kids who were a part of the site. They thought it was really cool. We could then take and use we could use barricade fencing, grab the rocks that we had been given for free, and build these little tiny gabion retaining walls, which could provide a seating area so when the women were in their 7th trimester and couldn't go out to the fields, which is where they put them, they could mine the kitchen garden as a break there, which could then grow produce that could then be sold. We also used the Gabions to start to manufacture an area for eating. And as we went, right, we would start to build a table and the kids would start to play with it. We said, why isn't the table just as cool to play with as it is to sit at? So let's design it as kind of a castle thing. That's why you got all those wacky legs in the table. They're meant to grab like surfaces so kids could make castles or whatnot underneath it. So it's just as cool underneath as it is to sit on top. That was a kid idea. That wasn't our idea. That was a kid idea. My son, who came with me, who was 3 years old at the time, jumped all over the piles. That's when we knew there was something going on, right? His wisdom, not mine. All that being said, I want to say that work is to growing pains. I would look in the mind, in the way that I operate. I'm still, if you look at that work, it is still very much in the same mind as Rural Studios. The innovations were largely tectonic. We were creating custom-made pieces which answered a certain set of demands, but they were not viral. They were still one-offs, beautiful one-offs, but they weren't viral. That's a problem. When you start to realize the way that informal settlements in other places of the world, which will soon house a third of the world's population, are growing, that you can get Jimmy Carter out to the site to build a house for Habitat for Humanity. By the time he's done, there will be 400 over there that were built using other means. And then he leaves and they'll steal the stuff from that one and build 20 more. Right? So we need to rethink the way we approach architecture as designing and as a construction. And to do that, we need to start thinking about things that regenerate on their own. That you plant them, and you plant them in a small thing, and then they develop a relationship with big things, with conditions, with infrastructures, with concerns shared by many people. And those things allow the architecture to earn the right to larger and larger and more complex forms. This is Street Urchin. Street Urchin actually came from the fact that we were asked to exhibit work from Romania in a gallery in Chicago, the A&D Gallery on Wabash. We said no. It didn't seem to us to make any sense to look back over our shoulder and say, look at the pretty things we did, aren't we wonderful? We were much more interested in creating an instigatory act. And so we said, can we do that instead? And they said, that'd be fine. So we did that. And what I did is I challenged my students to come up with an urban dwelling that was cheaper, more watertight and warmer and more portable than the cardboard tenements currently used by Chicago's homeless. So their budget, $0, right? The timeline, 4 weeks, placed a lot of pressure on their solutions. Eventually, they landed on this response, which took water bottles, unscrewed the tops, pressed a Walmart bag, or Target if you'd prefer, against it, created a joint with another Target bag, screwed the top back on, thus never puncturing the Target bag, creating a shingle-style, completely waterproof structure made out of Walmart bags and water bottles and rubber bands. They actually failed the course because it cost 50 cents. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not like that. Was it the tiger mom? I'm the tiger teacher or whatever, yeah? They fail. So this is what the guy looked like, right? Now, what's fascinating about this is that the weight of the occupant is actually distributed in all the bottles. So the bottles actually keep the occupant off the surface of the earth, which if you're ever camping, you know how important that is because the earth leaches the warmth from your body, quite literally. It also keeps them out of the puddle and out of the rain. The shingle style allows the rainwater to flow around the outside of the thing without ever coming into the thing. The shingles themselves actually have breathability, so we don't asphyxiate the occupant, right? Which is also important. The entire thing snaps like a shower cap over a shopping cart so that the occupant's goods and belongings are kept dry during the day as they're traversing about, if they so need. However, we never sent this to the gallery. That, again, would be a beautiful one-off. What we sent were 350 copies of an instruction manual. And we invited every patron to the gallery to take one and to make a better version of it, go hang out with someone who's homeless, make one with them. We didn't care. But what we wanted this to be is an instigatory act that would start to create architectures that far exceeded our poor capacity to make architecture to address this incredibly significant situation. We did not believe ourselves to be the holders of all the wisdom necessary to begin to engage the question of shelter and homelessness and blah, 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 blah. We're not that smart. And I'm sorry to say no one in this room is. Right? But if you can create works that might instigate other people to gradually pile their wisdom on, then maybe over time, we can accumulate enough wisdom to do some real damage in a positive way. You can download that on our website, by the way. I show this now because I'm really excited. Interior Design Magazine saw that work and picked it up. And what's exciting is if you flip this cover, we're the cover art, our 50-cent urban tent, right? Made in 4 weeks is the cover art. Right behind it is a multi-million-dollar condo by OMA, and then this, and then this, right? But we're the cover art, and we were 50 cents. That's exciting. Second, generate lots of losers. Your job as designers is not to squeeze out the perfect jewel that you then stand in front of at final review and defend to the death. Your job is not to create the bulletproof. Your job is to create inquiries. Your job is to create questions. Your job is to be able to intelligently answer those questions and provoke the next set of questions. That's your job, at least in this place. Maybe that other bulletproof thing works when you're designing a gap. So when you design a gap, after you graduate, use that. If you want to go to informal settlements and do some good work, don't use that. All right? The early days of business actually operate in this way. Think of when the internet came about. Think of when the car came about. Think of when any major innovation came about. How many companies came into being right on the verge of that, and how many of them still exist? Many, many, many bad ideas died. Failure was designed into the system so that the few that came out of it are actually surviving quite well. I believe that we can cultivate a similar Darwinian design process. I started this in the Reclaim Sky project to an extent where it was even a more open-ended discussion. And this was actually a Philadelphia-based nonprofit that had this section of land behind them that was festooned with razor wire and scorched with the sun, and they had too much programming, not enough space. So we used a reclaimed construction tarp to create the same kind of shade that you'd find within a tree. So they could still grow their garden. And by the way, the whole garden thing came into being because a building came tumbling down a week before this project ended. So we immediately switched tracks, grabbed all that brick, and built basically a second skin to the earth, a ribbon of brick that started to program out areas and matched our skin to the sky. But like the urchin, the important part is not the form. That urchin can actually be something that houses many people. The important part is once you understand how 4 bottles go together, you can build whatever you want. You can do it tonight if you want. You go download it. Same thing with this. Once you understand how this origami works to stitch together reclaimed construction fence, you can build anything you want. And I guarantee some of it will be better than this. But what I want to talk about, and it reframed the sky, and it was really a really great little project. We went to Mumbai to work with a group that runs schools on the construction sites of India. Mumbai Mobile Creches. Yes? Mumbai Mobile Creches. And we wanted to work with this group because they had a history, decades-long history in this place, running these schools. They ran them all over the place, sites all over the city. They would occupy the sites for 2-3 years, and then when the construction was done and the workers who lived on the site were basically kicked to the curb so that the well-heeled could occupy the condos they just built, they would then go set up another school, and another school, and another school, and this is how they operated. They wanted to grow. They wanted us to look at the mechanisms they currently use to realize space and say, are there other ways that we could do this more efficiently? So we came in and we started to look at what they were doing. And what we did is rather than get a napkin sketch, that drawing you saw happened like on the plane out of town. The way we actually approached this project is not as a napkin sketch of a school. Because why? The site would change anyways. I mean, the sites we'd be looking at then would be gone in 2 years. What's the point of that? But the conditions would remain the same. One of the conditions, for example, is the fact that these kids had a life whereby every 2 to 3 years, their neighborhood was erased. Their school was erased, their home was erased, the place they liked to play was erased, and they moved to a new construction site, realized a new school, new place, constantly changing. So we say, are there ways that we can build into the curriculum using things like scrap water bottles to actually build identity and questions of identity into the curriculum, whereby the kids could actually take these water bottles with them? They were filled with things that were important, that were, again, brought about by the curriculum. And they would use that as a method of introducing themselves to the people who would be their new friends for the next 3 years until they had to move on again. Are there strands that we can create using scrap that would allow certain pieces, and we're not saying this is their identity and we're solving it, but it's just a piece of their identity, right, to travel with them. It's a small thing. This was a project we worked with local auto rickshaw upholsterers. And we noticed that the kids had these floor mats that they loved. They would use it to nap on. They would use it to eat on. They would play with it, right? But it was always flat. So is there any way we can make that a space? I mean, these kids have no jurisdiction over their space at all. If we can make this, and so that's where this came from, is starting to say, is there a way that we can give them the power to carve out their own terrain and the mat could be three-dimensional. And they started to set up playing nooks. There's another kid here. They're playing, actually, a little game, right? As this kid, you can't see because he's hogging the camera. He's a good guy, though, right? And what was interesting is because we worked with auto rickshaw upholsterers there to develop this project, we designed ourselves out of the picture. If Mumbai Mobile Creches needs another one, they have 7 to 12 auto rickshaw upholsterers who are fully capable of making a new version of this and selling it to them probably at a fraction of the cost we could devise. In fact, they probably invented better versions of this by now anyways. Another piece of it was they would move onto the site, they'd erect a wall using brick and mortar or CMU, most likely, and mortar. After 3 years, the school would no longer be used, they'd knock it down and leave a pile of rubble. So we said, is there any way that we can maybe not make rubble in this situation? So we said, let's take the rebar they're using on the inside, and they line this, to create some structural continuity within the coursework, and say, can we use this rebar that you already have on site, that you're already using? Can we create a cage? Then can we use that tarp that you already have on site? Can we line that cage and then fill that with dirt? And then when you're done, you unplug the wall, the dirt goes from which it came, and you move this framework. Right? A way of kind of taking architecture that exists right now as this kind of monolith wall and saying, let's actually break that apart into something that you take pieces of it and then other pieces you leave behind. We actually hypothesized that it might be possible to plant on the outside of this wall certain plants that would actually clean the soil and the air. So in a cradle-to-cradle kind of move, the soil we leave behind is actually cleaner than the soil you put in the wall. And so rather than actually leaving debris, we leave clean soil. Another one is the kids were getting sick. They had enough gas to boil the water for drinking, 10%. The other 90% they used to wash the babies, to wash the dishes, et cetera, full of bacteria, leading to lots of illness. We wondered, is there a way to address this? So we looked at the local Kmart, big bazaar. I don't remember what it was called there. It wasn't Kmart, of course, whatever that was. We saw those sweater bags that you stuff a sweater in, hook a vacuum cleaner up to, suck the air out of. You know those things. We did a bit of research and found out that actually the plastic used in that is safer to place water in than the plastic in these water bottles you see here today, which can actually over time leach harmful contaminants into the water you're drinking. Sorry to burst your bubble. But there, actually milk jugs are better if you wanted to put your water in a milk jug. But this is made with a similar kind of plastic, which doesn't leach the contaminants out. You basically unfold this. It's a silver-sided tarp. Again, it's a scrap tarp, 4 grommets, sealed with the heat gun that they have at the local spice merchant shop. You unveil it to the sun, and in 8 hours, 90-some-odd% of the contaminants are purified. Is this saying that, hey, we've made potable water, all this? No, this is not anything so presumptuous as that. But it's saying, is there a step better than nothing? Can we start a movement somewhere, or at least instigate someone smarter than us to do so? Encourage collective selection. What this is referring to is the fact that a group actually is really, really good at selecting between innovations. That although invention might still be, to an extent, the domain of an individual, the selection within that are actually a group's place. And I want to bring up I'm going to mute this because it's loud. But the honeybee, of course. That bee colonies can search 6 miles or more from their hive for honey. And if a flower patch is within 2 kilometers of the hive, the bees will find it more than half the time. How do they do this? Do they sit around and deliberate and say, map out strategies based on what they've seen before, and then they send everyone? No. What they do is they send foragers out in every possible direction, right, from the hive. Go. We don't just go. The foragers go out, they land in the pollen that they're searching for, they come back, and they do a little dance. There it is. That's the waggle dance. The waggle dance is done in proportion to the strength of the pollen that they found. If they find a really good stash of pollen, they do a really funky dance. If the pollen stash is not so good, the dance isn't so great. The movement in the hive actually even tells the bees the direction of the pollen stash and the distance also from the hive. Those bees with the most convincing dance, waggle dance, attract new scouts through the conviction of their dance. Those that have a little lesser dance attract fewer scouts. They repeat this process several times until the bees have basically distributed themselves in proportion to the pollen within 2 kilometers of their hive, as if they had all the data to understand exactly where those pollen was. But they do it by sending individuals out and then allow the individuals to report back to them. It's fascinating. And I wonder if there's a way that we as designers might tap into that and encourage collective selection. We are a very voyeuristic society. We are ocular-centric. We learn and are biased towards our eyes. So how do I present this? And again, in India, we accumulated many, many images. Some by the kids. Like, we armed them with cameras because, we wanted their perspective on their schools and their places where they lived. The workers in the schools, we took it. We took pictures of the context as well as the final project. Well, what we did is we actually ended up designing a $2 projection system that cannibalized 2 U.S. Postal Service boxes. One was the outer housing. The other was the inner realm, which actually had an adjustable focal length so that you could actually focus this anywhere between 2 feet and 10 feet and cast a legible image. We then built one of these boxes for every image we took while in India, 350 or whatever. And in place of any kind of glossy photograph in the gallery space, we mounted a wall, 350 of these things in the gallery space. And patrons of the gallery were responsible for grabbing them, muting some, emphasizing others, overlapping others, to create an ever-changing display of what India was, based on their reading of this information. But where it really hit home is we allowed them to steal the box and asked them to find better sites. That it was our belief that the gallery space, and it was the AIA, Center for Architecture in Philadelphia, it was their gallery space, as wonderful as it was, we didn't think that was the ultimate location for this work. So we said, take a box and put it somewhere else. So that's what people did. And they started to carve out gallery spaces on the context of the street. You could see here using a news bin, whereby the people would discuss the work being presented there. In this kid, a child from Mumbai Mobile Creche is climbing a slide. On the inside of the box, there was more information if they'd like to get more information. There was actually a location. We had an online website. That's usually where they are, isn't it? We had a website. We had a website that constantly scoured Flickr for tagged projection mail. And the instructions on the box, and there were a list of instructions on if you were to deploy it like this, such as this person, take a photograph of that deployment, mount it on Flickr with the tag projection mail. We'll find it. We'll mount it on the online gallery, which is a companion to the street-based. All 350 boxes are now gone. They're in Canada. They're all over. And we're getting this back. And the idea is, how do you re-articulate the edge of a gallery space in a way that's potentially more inclusive? That people would never darken the step of a gallery because they've been taught not to, might actually be engaged in the conversation. Our latest work, which is actually exhibited in the Philadelphia Art Alliance right now. It was going to have an opening today. I was actually missing it to be with you fine people, which is fine. It actually got postponed till next Thursday, so I'll get the best of both worlds. Fence pocket is predicated upon the fact that sight is not a geography but a condition in my work. And the condition here that I was fascinated by were fence-scape deviations. That in the city of Philadelphia, like many cities, you'll have chain link fencing that outlines public and private, forms the line. Chain link fencing is really strong in one direction, really weak in the other. So you get these deviations that happen. In my mind, I believe these deviations become a thickening of that line between public and private, at least as assumed, and a potential place for occupation. So we created, using reclaimed tarp, I guess I have a tarp fetish. It's a safe place to admit this. And weaving, we created fence pocket. And here's a manual to fence pocket. And fence pocket, as you can see here, this is a really tiny divot or deviation, right? Becomes a place whereby people can cultivate gardens, they can create free stores, they can create a place to hang out as a bench, right? It's meant to facilitate new methods of occupying the streetscape based upon a scrap space and scrap stuff and overlooked stuff. To kind of ask questions about the way we privatize or make public land, right? But also to provide some interesting places maybe to hang out and read a book. Oh, here it is, yeah. And it is on Facebook. You can actually fan it if you want. You can fan Facebook, right? So there we go. It is custom tailored. We're actually very specific that we drop plumb bobs to make sure that we do not trespass on either the sidewalk or whatever. It is exactly tailored to the deviation site. Now the plant does trespass, I'm sorry to say, but that's the plant's problem. The final bit that I would use as a bit of substitution advice is think small. That if rooted upon large shared conditions, small stuff can create big shifts. I'd like to actually have 2 volunteers for this. And I'm not going to wait for hands. I'm going to ask you to come to the front, and I'm going to ask you to come to the front, right there. Young lady, right in the middle, who's looking like, please, dear God, don't let it be me. You. I want you. Please. Do you know her?
Yeah, I do.
You do know her?
Yeah, I know Sasha.
Oh my gosh. Well, all right. We'll try not to know Sasha. All right. I've handed you $10 in $1 bills. The way this game is going to work is, what's your name?
Bryce.
Bryce. Bryce is going to give Sasha any amount of those $10 bills he decides is right. If she accepts what he gives her, they both keep the money. If she rejects it, they give it back to me. And you cannot talk. Just give her money, and your choice is either to accept it and keep it, or reject it, and I get it. That's it. Thank you very much. You're done.
This was mine?
Yeah, that's yours. Go buy a latte. Go. Yeah, seriously. Go. And you get $1. Way to go, Bryce. Don't spend it all in one place. Well, everyone's like, I want to play that game with Bryce. He's so nice.
At the end of this thing?
No, you go buy a latte. It's not mine. That's called the Ultimatum Game. And logically, the most logical thing to do would be to what? No. No. The most logical thing to do would be to keep 9 and give 1, or keep 10 and give 0. But you don't keep 10 and give 0 because you know the other person will reject 0. You got to get their skin in the game, right? So you keep 9 and give 1. That's logical. What everyone here who said split it, you're actually responding to an innate response in all of us to fairness and justice that is actually not logical, but it's built in nonetheless. I don't know what the hell Bryce did. Right? It was off the map. But suffice to say, he's a really nice guy. I bring this up because the way small pieces can create big changes is if you root it on stuff like that. If you root your work on innate responses that are already built in to either us, our environment, our communities, then small stuff can become big stuff. And it becomes big stuff regardless of whether you're there or not, if you so root it. I'll give you another, Thomas Schelling, a social scientist. He noticed that there was a log jam trying to get to the second floor class. 2 narrow stairs during the break. Schelling then asked his 10 a.m. class to begin taking the front stairway up and the back one down. Within 3 days, the 9 and 11 classes, without explicit instruction, had followed suit. This slight tweak allowed everyone, it removed the logjam, allowing everyone to reach class on their own and find a good solution without forcing it. It's important to note that students shifted behavior, not because they wanted to address logjam, not because they were demanded to do so, just because they saw a short-term gain from so doing. And it just so happened that it also created a long-term gain. But it was just a short-term gain. I want to point to Tweenbot. You guys know Tweenbot? Oh, this is fabulous. You guys need to know Tweenbot. Get the Tweenbot video up here. All right. TweenBot worked because TweenBot attached itself to innate responses within the passersby. They weren't put up to guide TweenBot. They had no monetary incentive to guide TweenBot. But somehow, that stupid robot did make it to the other end of the park, right? And that passersby who had, they just was their human kindness. And maybe she tapped into our innate response to cuteness. I mean, he is a cute little guy, right? Or the fragile, or the innocent. Whatever she tapped into worked. Because he got there, and she was just filming. She wasn't a part of the picture. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we began to address issues such as how do you make informal settlements in Haiti seismically sound to save lives? That rather than march in with the Corps of Engineers and try to build 1 million houses that are seismically sound, is there any way we could think like TweenBot in that? Is there any way that we can start to create something small that would replicate itself and gradually get to the other side of the park? That's a question that fascinates me. And it's a question I'm going to broach in Bolivia. I went last summer. I'm going back over the next 2 years. In Bolivia, kids who work on the street don't have time for school because they got to eat. And then right now, the brick and mortar school is too far and doesn't have enough value to them to warrant not eating, so they don't go. And because they don't go, they get just enough education to continue the lifestyle their father or mother had before them, a shoeshine lifestyle. There's no possibility to do anything else unless you're incredibly motivated and incredibly lucky. It's a very thin line. There's a group there that we stumbled upon a first trip that every Saturday unrolls tarps in main squares, and this tarp will be about 2D art, and this tarp will be about music, and they'll teach the music for 3 hours on a Saturday. And the kids of the vending moms and dads will come and they'll learn music, and after 3 hours they're gone. Now, as an architect, I'm fascinated to know, is there anything, architecturally speaking, that exists or could exist between a 3-hour tarp and a brick and mortar school that lasts forever and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars? Is there anything in between there that maybe say, let's build education this way rather than do this and try to demand it all come in? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going back this summer. I'm going to take a small team, and we're going to deploy extra small versions of the school. All of the sizes of the school are based upon the vending architectures already existing. We're going to hotwire into the architecture of the kids rather than impose an architecture. So we're going to slip in there. That's the size of a card, postcard. The next size up is actually the size of a shoeshine kit. And what does a school look like if it's in a shoeshine kit? What's a school look like if it's in a hand cart? And what's a school look like if it's in a vending booth? Less important maybe than what it looks like is how does it function? What aspects of the curriculum actually need to be in a vending booth? And what aspects of the curriculum could be handled just fine with an extra small card on a street corner? Thank you very much. A card costs 2 cents. A vending booth, you have to go through back market channels. Very complicated. Costs $700, plus you got to grease the guy who owns the electricity just by virtue of having the vending booth there, right? So that costs another $200. You got to incentivize it. So are you going to spend $1,000 on a vending booth, or are you going to get thousands and thousands and thousands of cards? Obviously, you're going to use the card whenever possible. And what we're going to do over the next 2 years, me and whatever team joins me, is we're going to deploy the extra small this summer. We're going to look at how they function and use architecture as a metric of understanding the way education already exists and might exist in the future. And as we deploy these things, we're going to observe how they're used, how they're not used. We actually deployed a couple last summer. It was accidental. A lot of our work's accidental. I shouldn't admit that. It's very intentional. Last summer, we wanted to get insight on how these kids viewed their lives, how they viewed where they hang out, where they live, where they work, etc. So we gave them cameras and sent them out and asked them to show us these things. They came back and their thumb was over the lens and they forgot to press the flash and everyone was posed and all of this, right? That the naivety they had with the camera was actually getting away of their expressive voice, that you couldn't read what they were trying to say because they weren't experienced with the medium. So that prompted us to give a 4-part little mini-series on Photography 101. Where we went over basics like, here's when you turn on a flash and here's when you don't. Here's where the lens is. Don't put your thumb over it. To even instruments of balance, starting to color, starting to talk about color theory a little bit, right? Symmetry, asymmetry, candid, posed. We created little cards this big. Why? Because they were cheap. And they were small. They could fit them in their breast pocket. And on those cards, we would have a little picture that would show asymmetry. And then in Spanish and English, we'd have the word asymmetry. We gave them these cards. They were reminders. They're like, they'll pitch these things. We walked around the city 2 weeks later. All the shoeshine boys had kept them. All the shoeshine boys had stuffed them in their shoeshine box. The real estate in their lives is this. That's all they carry with them. That's all they got. And so to earn the right to have something even this big fit in that little bit of real estate, we were incredibly flattered. We're like, this has warranted that space. We couldn't believe it. We're like, there's something here. And then we kept walking around and we noticed that the shoeshine boys would pull out the cards and refer back to them. We also noticed the shoeshine boys would pull their friends over and trade notes. It is my argument that that's a school. It's my argument that they're learning on the streets of La Paz photography without brick and mortar and without the architect ever demanding they go to school or a truant office or anything. They're doing it willingly. They're carving out space in their lives for a school because they want to. And we're going to grow that little school. And as it demands it, and as we see aspects of the curriculum that can't be handled by the card, and the architecture earns the right to exist in a larger format, and earns the right to more dollars, and earns the right to more people populating it, then it'll get to be a shoeshine box. And that'll be the end of our work this summer. And then we'll go back and we'll talk about hand carts. And then we'll go back and we'll talk about vending booths. And finally, 2 years out, after doing this, we'll understand what architecture wants to be when it's the architecture you've been studying, when it's the brick and mortar thing. And in 2 years' time, we'll build a center for the arts for kids who live on the street or work on the street. But it won't be something that we're napkin sketching through Google research. It'll be something that has earned the right to exist where it is and how it is through all of the previous architectures that came and went before it. And that, in my mind, at least as I understand it right now, is what I would postulate as a working model to maybe a more responsible way of operating, and maybe beginning to function as humanitarian designers who give more than a damn. I thank you very much.